Hi everyone. Thank you so much for the people who listened to the first episode. Um, I got some really nice comments from friends, which is really lovely to hear. And I hope you continue to enjoy this reading of The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, again, just like last time, before we begin reading, I'd like you to take a few moments and find a comfortable place to be. Wherever this is for you, whether it's a chair or a couch or on the floor or in your bed, somewhere where you can rest completely, let your muscles relax off, and spend a few moments not thinking about what's going on in the world, but just escaping into this wonderful, wonderful tale. Now, I didn't do this last time, and I feel like I should have, but this book, The Hobbit, this in particular is a 50th anniversary edition, and it's illustrated by Michael Haag or Haig. I'm not too sure in the pronunciation, but it's really, really beautiful. And if you can get your hands on a copy, I'd really recommend it. So if you're ready, let's begin. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and "Dwalin, at your service," he said with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I'm just about to make tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. "And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation?" They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake, when there came another even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you have got here at last." That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they've already begun to arrive already," he said when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and "Balin, at your service," he said with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it however painful, he might need to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if it is all the same to you, good sir," said Balin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some seed cake, if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off too, to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then a pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. Just a moment. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarfs, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped. As soon as the door began to open, Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarfs?" he said. "Keely, at your service," said the one, "and Feely," said the other, and they both swept their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin here already, I see," said Keely. "Let us join the throng." "Throng?" thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip in the corner, while 4 dwarfs sat around the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous. When ding dong, a ling dang, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say by the sound," said Keely. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his heads in his hands and wondered what had happened and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again, louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," after one another. Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods and a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, and some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set on the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarfs were starting on a round of buttered scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry, and altogether bewildered and bewithered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they fell in, one on top of another. More dwarfs, 4 more. And there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent in the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat, then open the door like a pop-gun. Let me introduce Bilfa, Boffa, Bomba, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Biffa, Boffa, and Bomba, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, in fact no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased for failing flat on Bilbo's mat with Biffa, Boffa, and Bomba on top of him. For one thing, Bomba was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that he just grunted, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now, we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me. And for me, said Thorin. And raspberry jam and apple tart, said Biffa. And mince pies and cheese, said Boffer. And pork pie and salad, said Bomba. And more cakes, and ale, and coffee, if you don't mind, called the other dwarfs through the door. Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow, Gandalf called after him as the hobbit stumped off to the pantries. And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles. Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself, thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled onto big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. Confiscate and bebother the dwarfs, he said aloud. Why don't they come lend a hand? Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Fili and Kili behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlour and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party, with the 13 dwarfs all around, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least bit an adventure. The dwarfs ate, and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. I suppose you will all stay to supper? He said in his politest, unpressing tones. Of course, said Thorin. And after. We shan't get through this business till late. We must have some music first. Now, to clear up. Thereupon the 12 dwarfs, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped on their feet, and all made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top, with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. Please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage. But the dwarves only started to sing. I'm not too sure if I can sing this one. This might have to be more of a spoken word. Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones in the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl. Pound them up with a thumping pole. And when you're finished, if any are whole, send them down to the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. So carefully, carefully with the plates. And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away safe and quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning around and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whenever he told one to go, or wherever he told one to go, it went, up the chimney, or behind a clock, or on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He spent smaller smoke rings from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up in the wind over the hill. Now I think I'll leave it there for now, make it a little bit shorter, keep it to around 15 minutes. I do hope you enjoyed part 2 of The Hobbit, and I will see you tomorrow night. And in the meantime, Take some time for yourself. Practice those self-care activities that you've been putting off and you know you're supposed to do. Reach out to others and pay it forward. Good night, guys.